When we see our modern political leaders breaking the law and seeming to evade punishment or even investigation, we naturally become angry at the lack of accountability that allows them to get away with it. Our anger comes from the expectation that our leaders should be held accountable to the same laws that govern everyone else in the country. We might assume that the principle of equality before the law is timeless, that rulers have always been subordinate to the same behavioral restraints as their subjects. Seems like a no-brainer, right? It is absolutely not the case. The principle of equality before the law had to be fought for, and fought for mightily hard over centuries. After a long struggle, it was finally enshrined in one single epoch-making document.
A piece of paper?
A large piece of paper. I'm Luke Pierce, and this is the Radical History channel, where we bring to light the people throughout history who risked everything for the kind of social, economic and democratic rights we enjoy today. In 12th century Britain, the monarchy derived its power from God. People accepted that sovereigns had a right to rule in the way they saw fit. The power of England's monarchs was based on custom and patronage. The monarch handed out land and titles to local lords, gaining pledges of loyalty and protection from those lords in return. As long as the king restrained his behaviour within certain limits of conduct, the barons were happy and the system worked. But when King John came to the throne, that all changed. It turned out that the barons had a limit. In 1199, Prince John succeeded his brother Richard to the throne of England. If, like mine, your clearest image of King John is that of a thumb-sucking lion in the 1973 Disney animation, you might think of the real man as an ineffective and cowardly ruler seeking to tax his people to the limit. But John was worse than that. He demonstrated a devastating combination of cruelty, which alienated his barons, and military incompetence, which drove them to rebellion. It might not have mattered to the barons as an isolated incident that John forced Geoffrey de Mandeville to marry his ex-wife Isabella and pay 20,000 marks for the privilege of keeping her lands. It might not have mattered on its own that John took his affair with the wife of Hugh de Neville to such an extreme that she ended up offering the king 200 chickens that she may lie one night with her husband. It might not have mattered at all to the barons that King John imprisoned his own nephew Arthur, then killed him while drunk and threw the body into a river. And it might not have mattered that when William de Braose spoke unguardedly about Arthur's death, John outlawed de Braose, using a tax law as a pretext, then took de Braose's wife Matilda and their child to Corfu Island and starved them both to death. It might not even have bothered the barons too much that John falsely claimed his abuses were according to the law and custom of England. What really mattered and proved the final straw for England's nobility was John's defeat to the French at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. John had justified abusing his barons and bleeding the tax system of England with his plan to retake the lands in France that had formerly been under English rule. John promised to use the cash he'd taken to conquer the territory and then share it among the barons to pay them back. But he not only failed to take any more land in France, he actually lost 80% of the territory he already governed. The barons might have tolerated being ruled by an awful person if he was a military hero. But when John failed militarily, he had no friends to help him. The lords threatened to crown the heir to the French throne, Louis, King of England. This brought John to the negotiating table in June 1215. In exchange for rescinding their invitation to Louis of France, the lords made King John sign a legal charter, a document of 63 clauses which, for the first time ever, set official limits on the king's powers.
It was so big they called it the big piece of paper and put it in Latin.
John's excesses had shown that a model of unquestioned divine kingship could always be as bad as its worst possible ruler. Let's not be under any illusion that this document was some kind of progressive revolution. It wasn't. Most of it was simply about rolling back the king's powers to levy fines, convict barons for minor offences and confiscate their land. It enshrined some prejudices of the time. One clause states that the word of a woman isn't enough to start a murder investigation. And there was some peculiar stuff in there as well.
Clause 33 is one of my favorites.
I don't think we need to go through every clause.
All fish wares are in future to be entirely removed from the Thames and the Medway, and throughout the whole of England except on the sea coast.
Thank you, Schrodinger.
And let's not forget Clause 35.
Do let's forget Clause 35.
There is to be one measure of wine throughout our kingdom, and one measure of ale, and one measure of corn, namely the quarter of London, and 1 breadth of dyed, russet, and haberjet clothes, that is, 2 ells within the borders, and let weights be dealt with as with measures.
The clauses of real interest to us are clauses 39 and 40.
I don't think you know what a selvage is.
I do not know what a selvage is.
Or an ell.
No.
I see.
They state, no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Clause 39 only referred to free men. At least half of England's population at the time were serfs, who were forced to work for local lords. But nevertheless, it established the idea of trial by jury according to law. And Clause 40 made it clear that everyone was subject to the idea of justice, including the king. One amazing thing is that while the barons were clearly self-interested, they seem to have expanded the protections of Magna Carta beyond their own ranks. There were clauses referring to the rights, or at least the proto-rights, of serfs. Clause 20 includes serfs in the list of groups that should be given punishments appropriate to the scale of their crimes. Clause 28 includes serfs in the protection of theft from constables and bailiffs. The motivation for this apparently generous inclusivity on the part of the barons was most likely to protect themselves from future attempts by John to circumvent any clause that referred to the rights of a named group, such as nobles, which John could potentially define to suit his own ends. So they cast the net wide and used terms like everyone and no one. The Magna Carta deal fell apart almost as soon as it was agreed when King John persuaded the Pope to declare it void. This led the barons to invite France to invade England. They offered the throne to the future Louis VIII.
So if it barely survived 5 minutes, how did it survive the next 800 years?
Listen on, Schrodinger, all shall become clear. In spring 1216, Louis landed with his army in England. He was declared king in London. Then he captured Winchester. A year after signing and reneging on the big piece of paper, and in the middle of this French invasion, King John of England died of dysentery. His child son Henry became king. With French conquest a real prospect, King Henry needed his rebel barons back on side immediately. So he reissued the charter. Henry defeated Louis at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, and so prevented a repeat of 1066. But subsequent monarchs realised that they could use Magna Carta as a perpetual bargaining chip with their nobles. The charter kept on being reneged on, and then reissued throughout the 13th century. But using the Magna Carta as a political football eventually caught up with England's royalty. The century-long back and forth between kings and nobles had the effect of keeping the ideas of the charter alive in the popular imagination. Knowledge of the charter became widespread in England, despite a lack of literacy and newspapers. The barons, of course, had an incentive to publicise the deal because it gave them rights. In 1297, Magna Carta was subsumed into English law.
Fake it till you make it. That's what I always say.
The agreement was finally out of the king's hands and could now only be changed by Parliament. By this point, ordinary people were invoking Magna Carta and referring to their legal rights. There's no evidence that before Magna Carta, ordinary people saw the idea of equality before the law as a dream worth entertaining. People accepted the complete and utter authority of the monarch. Magna Carta changed everything. It introduced the principle that even monarchs anointed by God had to obey the law. References to Magna Carta abound through the subsequent centuries. It became symbolic of this core idea of equality before the law. People would invoke Magna Carta without reference to any specific part of it, and in many cases without ever having read it. The significance of Magna lay not only in what it actually said, but perhaps to an even greater extent in what later generations claimed and believe it had said. Sometimes the myth is more important than the actuality. Thomas Jefferson argued that English King George III's unspecified breaches to Magna Carta justified the revolution of the American colonies. Of course, Magna Carta was far from complete by later standards. It didn't guarantee fundamental things like a free press or liberty of conscience. And that's even before we get to the kind of rights for women and minorities that we'd want a legal document to contain today. Nevertheless, this, an 800-year-old piece of paper, managed to do something incredible: restrain the powers of absolute monarchy. And over time it's inspired more powerful pieces of paper, such as the American Constitution and the Declaration of Human Rights, that specify rights and laws to which everyone in a society is entitled and subject. So while we might be frustrated that those in power sometimes seem to ignore the law with impunity, we can at least look in awe at the short text which gave us the right to be angry in this way.
Wait, it was short? I thought it was called Magna Carta, the big piece of paper.
Big things can come in small packages, Schrodinger. If you enjoyed this video, take a look at this video about how ordinary people continued their fight for social and economic rights in Britain.